Okay, welcome to the first talk of the 2020-2021 Science Unwrapped series, a series called Brave New World. My name's Greg Podgorski. I'm Associate Dean in the College of Science and Chair of the Science Unwrapped Committee. Nick Flann, a faculty member in the Department of Computer Science and a close friend of mine, will speak tonight about the spread of memes through social media. He'll talk about both the societal aspects of how these ideas can move quickly and the computer science aspects of how in a day of artificial intelligence, how these technologies can be harnessed, sometimes in a sinister way, to drive the spread of disinformation through memes. So a few words about Nick. Nick was born in Preston, Lancashire, England. And he grew up in England, but then made the voyage across the ocean and across a continent to pursue a PhD in computer science at Oregon State University. After getting his PhD at Oregon State, he came to USU in 1991, where we've been lucky enough to have him with us since that time. Nick's research interests are eclectic. So I know Nick as a close collaborator in computational biology. So Nick really loves many aspects of biology, and we've had a lot of fun over the last really 15 years working together on different aspects of biological modeling. But Nick's research interests don't stop with biology. Nick has done a lot in robotics. And here's something that I failed to tell you a moment ago. Nick's undergraduate degree was in electrical engineering from Coventry University in England. And that training in electrical engineering helped him get into robotics, where he holds a number of patents. Nick is also really interested in clean energy. Nick is a passionate environmentalist and has done a lot with clean energy, and he holds numerous patents in solar technology. So again, a Renaissance man doing so many different things. Nick's talk tonight, as I say, is about memes. I won't say any more on that topic, but one thing I want to do is to encourage you to submit questions during Nick's talk and after, during the question and answer period. And you can do that by going to our Science Unwrapped website. You find a link to the AggieCast network. That's where you, of course, be watching this talk, but on AggieCast, you'll see a link for a chat feature where you can get questions submitted. I'll be fielding those questions and giving them to Nick after he's done with the main part of his talk. That will be a live question and answer session. It'll begin somewhere around 7:40 tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Nick, and I think you'll really enjoy his talk tonight. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone to Science Unwrapped. Today, I'm going to talk about the meme menace, how disinformation spreads on social media. So, what I'm going to talk about is about memes, and everyone here is familiar with memes. Perhaps you think of a meme as a cat video or something fun that you send to your friends. So, what I'm going to do is give you a different perspective on memes and think about perhaps how they can be a menace to society and how disruptive they can be and how they can start to influence the future. And this is especially true in the internet age and the age of artificial intelligence. And in particular, when memes are used to spread disinformation. So we'll get into quite a lot of detail on this today. But first, what I want you to do is let's make sure we understand what a meme is. They're like biological viruses. So, and we're of course very familiar with viruses right now with the COVID pandemic. Okay. What memes do is they spread and influence humans. That's the key idea. It's not just maybe fun, it can actually change your behavior and change some of the outcomes of society perhaps. And now memes thrive in a world because we have the internet and because we have advanced artificial intelligence. Memes can be engineered deliberately to trick people using advanced artificial intelligence techniques like deepfakes. So I'll talk about those too. So let's just get some definitions down first. So a meme, we can think of it simply as an infectious idea. So that spreads. So it's like a mind virus, it's often called. And then let's see, in the title we have social media. So what is social media? Well, to be honest, I didn't put a definition there because my feeling is everyone knows social media. Almost everyone uses social media. Now, here's the deal, though. I'm going to give you perhaps a different perspective on social media. So we'll get to that a bit later. And then let's talk about disinformation. Disinformation is a form of information, but it's designed to deliberately be misleading or biased. It could be manipulated narrative or manipulated facts, or it could just be straight propaganda. Let me tell you a story. Imagine it's election day, which I believe is 39 days from now. Okay? So here's what happens on that day. A viral video spreads. It spreads through Facebook, informing a local community that nearby polling stations have been closed and moved. And the story tells that, oh, the new one is 10 miles away from where you live, and oh, but it closes at 5 p.m. Okay? So people believe this media because the announcer is someone they recognize. It's a friend in their network, or maybe it's the mayor of the town, and they say, okay, it must be true. But what happens then is during that day, people have to work. They look at the clock and say, oh no, I can't make it to the polling station. Oh well, I won't be able to vote today. Okay. Now, that can happen. But here's the problem, is that the community targeted with this video tends to support a specific party. Let's just call it Party X right now, just to be general. And that trusted source that presented the information to them, that actually was a deep fake created by advanced artificial intelligence, a convincing imposter. And in addition, the whole effort was paid for by Party Y, the competition of Party X. Okay, now here's what happens in the outcome. The vote was actually pretty close, so the supporter of Party Y, through that media campaign, won the election, and then of course Party Y gets more influence now, gets more power, and they can use the same tools to just grow their power. Okay, so that is happening, it's happened, and it could easily happen again. Now I'm using X and Y. Notice how I use Party X, Party Y, because I want to be abstract. I want to be general. I don't necessarily want to get specific because there's so many parties at play. In fact, rather than a party, it could be a political party, but it also could be what you could call an interested party. So it could be corporations, individuals, organizations, it could be almost anything, but they want to influence people and change their minds and also change the behaviors, right? So if it's not good enough just to change someone's mind. You want to change what they do, and then it really makes a difference. Okay, and the other reason I like variables is because I'm a computer scientist and we use them a lot in code and mathematics. Okay, now I gave you a little story that happened in one town that affected an election. Okay, yeah, that can happen. But now imagine if that happens, not just, it happens, it's repeated over the whole country. So it's not just one town, it's all over, counties, states, cities, nationally. It's happening everywhere, okay, across the whole country. And then, but people are getting all these different messages, all targeted to them, and they're reacting in different ways. Perhaps some people are going to go out and vote more because of it, while others will be voting less. And all this will be orchestrated by social media, advanced machine intelligence, and the people who are paying for all this. Okay, now, okay, so it's not sounding too good. Now, okay, that was election day. Now imagine if it's happening not just on election day, but every single day of the year, 24 hours every day. Okay? And that was in America. Imagine if it's happening across the whole world. Okay? So, This is the kind of future that is starting to happen. Okay, we're starting to see it now, but it's creeping up on us. And I believe within really a few years, within 5 years perhaps, this could become the dominant process where people make decisions based on this kind of information and through the use of social media. Okay, so in this talk, I'll really focus on social media, but if we look at the title of the talk again, okay, what we see the title of the talk, and it involves disinformation, memes, and spreading. Okay, so let me focus on spreading first, because to be honest, we're actually quite familiar with spreading. So this diagram looks a little complicated, but give me a little while to explain it. So this, of course, is how COVID spreads. So COVID spreads through the environment. So let's go through the process of what's happening. So what we see here, okay, you can see that, I'm circling it. This is the COVID virus. Okay, it's actually quite interesting looking, and this is a nice, precise scientific diagram of its shape. It's incredibly tiny. It's smaller than a human hair in size, in thickness, and it's quite complex. It's made of different components, but it's just a biological machine. Okay, it's a sophisticated biological machine. Okay, so COVID, that's what it is. Okay, so let's look at the kind of life cycle of it. It infects someone. Okay, so it somehow enters their body. Then what happens? It goes from just perhaps even a few particles. It enters the cells of the host, which is the human. And those cells, often in the lungs, actually get hijacked by the RNA, so that now the cells basically switch gears and start replicating the virus instead of doing what they should be doing, which is servicing the host, right, the body. So this is an image where we can see all those little orange circles are actually different unique COVID viruses, particles. So you can see how we've multiplied tremendously. And then what happens is these particles move into the lungs. And we can see this is a real scientific image here taken, and the illuminated parts here are actually billions of viral particles that have invaded the lungs. Okay. Now, why does the virus go for the lungs? Well, the reason it goes for the lungs is because the lungs are in a very effective way to spread the virus. So if we look at this, we see, let's go again over the process. So we see a replication, and then we see the means for spreading of the virus here. But the key idea I want to point out is what the virus is really doing is changing the behavior of the host. Right? The host in this case is a human, and we get a behavior change in that person. So what they start doing is coughing and sneezing. It's really important because why? Because coughing and sneezing makes the virus spread. Right? So now we have infection here, and the COVID is being transferred through this change in behavior of the host of coughing and sneezing. And then we start seeing, well, okay, then we have the environment now in which the COVID is existing. And the COVID infects one individual, and then that infects another individual, and that one infects this one, etc. So we're seeing this rapid spread through the population. And then, of course, every person who is infected goes through this same process again. So what I'll call this slide, you'll see this slide actually quite a few times in different contexts. But what I want you to understand about it, this is simply an algorithm. This is what we'd call an algorithm in computer science. Okay, it's an algorithm for replicating these viral particles. Okay, so we're talking about spreading, remember. So, and we're using COVID as an example. Okay, so we see some recent data. I think I pulled this off today. So we see over here, this is the spatial distribution of the virus. And we can see over the last 14 days, the size of the circles is how many people are infected in that area and over the last 14 days. So we can see India here, of course, North America, Brazil are the main places where the virus is spreading currently. All right, so another way to think about it is we can think about it in terms of time. Okay, so this is time on this dimension, and this is the count here. Now, one very important thing to understand about this graph is this is the graph of new cases. Right? So this is how many new cases are happening each day. So this is, in a sense, when we see this go up, it's like the acceleration of it. It's increasing, so more and more people each day are actually catching it. Okay, so this is spreading, right? We're seeing it in real time here. Okay, so let's look at a graph. Okay, so what we see here, now this is the total number of deaths in different countries. Okay, and what I want you to see here, so what we see here again is time, is the days, and then what we see here is the number of deaths. Okay, and what we can see, if we look at the shape, one thing perhaps that we can take comfort in is the fact that the rate is slowing down. So the curves are slowing down. So in other words, we're getting less and less people dying. Okay, so that's a good thing. But let's look at some lines here. These lines are interesting because this shows the slope of these curves. So imagine if the number of deaths doubled every day. Okay. Then what would happen is these curves would just go in a straight line all the way up there. So within, say, 10 days, we'd have 100,000 deaths, okay, if they doubled every day. Well, if they doubled every 2 days, we'll get a slower rate, okay, and then every 3 days. Okay. So that is the power of spreading. In this kind of doubling process of being able to rapidly take over a population is why spreading is so important. Okay, so let's look at some other examples of spreading. Okay, and here I'll pick a different one. Okay, this is probably, I don't know if you've heard of this one. It's called the Lancet fluke. And I want to revisit the technique that COVID does it, and then what I'll do is compare it. So let's go back to the COVID for a minute before I get to the fluke. Okay? So let's just look at one most important thing here is changing behavior. So the virus changes the behavior by forcing the host to cough and sneeze. And so bear that in mind, and let's see how familiar this algorithm is for these other species. So the Lancet fluke is, this is what it looks like. I'm not a biologist, but I know biologists. And this is an image, close-up image of a Lancet fluke. It looks, I think, quite interesting. Okay? So what it does, it gets into a carpenter ant. Okay, so this is a carpenter ant. Probably people have seen these. See them a lot with decaying wood in forests. Okay? So it enters a carpenter ant, just the same way that the COVID virus enters us. And then the fluke goes inside the carpenter ant and replicates. So here's another microscopic image of that same process where each one of these little circles is a unique Lancet fluke. All right, so we're seeing that going on inside the ant. Now here's what's interesting about this case is, remember, the Lancet fluke is trying to make copies of itself. That's what it does, right? That's what it does for a living. That's why it exists. It's just simply being able to copy itself using this system. So what it has to do is just like a COVID has to do, the Lancet fluke has to change the behavior of the ant. Okay? So what does it do? It actually goes inside the brain of the ant and controls it so that the ant will climb to the top of a plant and bite onto the leaf. And then what happens is it dies, and if you can get a close-up of this maybe, or you can see this carefully, here is an example of the ant at the top of a plant, died. And now what we're seeing is these are actually little mushrooms growing out of its body. So the fluke consumes the ant's body and produces these fruiting bodies that then spread the lancet fluke. Okay? So that's the lancet fluke. And what I want to show is this is a biological agent, and it's using the same kind of processes, it's running the same algorithm as COVID. So one more example. Okay, so remember this talk is about memes. So obviously I can't give a talk about memes without mentioning cats. So let me talk about cats. Okay, and another interesting biological agent that uses the same spreading algorithm to replicate itself. So here it is. It's a protozoan. Okay, here's a really cool electron microscope image of it. Okay, so its host is a rat. And actually what's interesting about this, it actually has two hosts. It lives in cats and it lives in rats. But I want to focus on the rat component of it because that's the host that actually loses out on the infection. So what this protozoan does, it enters the rat, and just similar to the fluke, it goes into the rat's brain, and then it basically mixes up the brain and changes the rat's mind in a way. It changes its behavior. Here's how it changes it. In quite an interesting way, it basically starts to believe that cats are my friends. So when I see a cat, I don't run away anymore, okay, because of the influence of this protozoan. So I become friends, like in that picture there. So the rat thinks, at least from the rat's point of view, that the cats are going to be friendly now. So it's changed its behavior. And of course, what happens next is now that rat is much easier to catch. So the cats eat the rats, and they catch these rats, more of them, right? Because they're easy to catch. So then what happens is the protozoan moves into the cat and actually replicates again in the cat's stomach, and then the cat, basically poops it out, and then it starts the process again. But what's interesting, it doesn't hurt the cats at all. In fact, the cats are just an intermediary. But it needs the cats as part of its life cycle, and it needs the rats. But the most important thing I want you to get here is who's the winner in this, right? Who's benefiting from this system running? And I'll tell you who isn't benefiting are the rats, okay? So really who's benefiting is the protozoan, okay? That's the replicator. So let's think about that. I want to use the term replicator from now on rather than viruses or protozoans or whatever. It's because we're going to generalize the concept of what a replicator is. So, let's look at it, let's stretch our minds a little bit here, and let's think about it from the replicator's point of view. Okay, so imagine if I'm a replicator. Now, I could be a virus particle, I could be one of those protozoans or whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm just a replicator. That's what I do. I make copies of myself. So what's the characteristics of successful replicators? Well, hey, I want to be able to exploit the vulnerabilities in the host so they become infected. Right? I need to get in there. I need to get into the lungs. I need to be eaten somehow. I need to get into the brains. I need to get inside them somehow. Okay? And in order to do that, I'm going to try and exploit the vulnerabilities of the host. Okay, so once I'm in the host, the most important thing is I want to change the behavior of the host so that they work for me now. They work for the replicator, infecting others. Okay, so now the ant is climbing up the stem and then dying to spread the replicator. Right? So this behavior has changed. And I exist in an environment where I can contact many potential and vulnerable hosts. Okay, so that brings us to the meme. Now we're switching gears. What I've described is an algorithm that replicators exploit in our system today on the planet. Right? So this is part of nature. In fact, the idea of replicators and how they can be successful is just, in a sense, a law of nature, in that if a replicator is good at copying itself and spreading through a population, it's going to exist and it's going to prosper. So, but this brings us to memes. And wait a minute, what was I just talking about with the biological agents? Let's quickly go back. One thing I want to show you, the cats got to eat the rats because the rats changed their behavior. They changed their minds, in fact. They had a different perspective on cats now. They thought, cat, okay, I'm going to go make friends, right, rather than run away like they normally would. So the toxoplasma changed the rat's mind. Okay, so memes are like that. But in this case, the hosts are human. So the idea of a meme was first discovered or propagated by Richard Dawkins, and he wrote this in his book, The Selfish Gene, and it was published in 1976. So Richard Dawkins defined a meme as follows. Memes, which are discrete units of knowledge, gossip, jokes, and so on, are to culture what genes are to life. Just as biological evolution is driven by the survival of the fittest genes in the gene pool, cultural evolution may be driven by the most successful memes. Okay? So, and remember that was written in 1976. This was written before the internet. And in fact, when memes came out, they were either completely ignored by most of the population, but a few in the community actually thought it was a terrible idea and almost were offended by it. In particular, for example, religious communities and people with deep convictions were offended because the idea of memes undermines the cherished ideas about what they believe. Is it really true that what I believe is simply a meme that somehow got into my mind and took over? So it was very objectionable to many people. And then the academics likewise didn't like memes because they felt they weren't very useful. They didn't, knowledge jokes. I mean, there's got to be more going on in culture than that. So what I would say is when memes originally came out, before the internet, they were just ideas. So it was dismissed. But I think nowadays, with the internet, what we're seeing is memes have become much more important. So, but let's start with harmless memes, all right? So these are some of the dated memes here. And of course, I've got a meme that defines a meme here for you. So the definition of a meme is a picture with text on it. Of course, it's got to be capitalized, and it's got to have a cool picture on it. Okay, people are familiar with those. And maybe a lot of you have actually made these. They're very easy to make and spread. Okay, and of course, we've got a cat there, very famous cat, looking, I think it actually looks kind of happy today. And then we have other ones, older memes. Some of these memes are before the internet. Okay, so I don't know if the young people may recognize that smiley face there in the button. That is actually a postage stamp that was produced in the 70s. And it was a meme too, okay? And then we see some examples too. Kilroy was here. So these kind of memes were actually before the internet. And then I see a few simple, harmless memes after the internet. And these memes, so how do these memes work? Well, here's an example. Okay, it looks familiar, right? We're seeing the same spreading algorithm as we've seen before. But in this case, we're dealing with memes now. So let's pick the Have a Nice Day meme. Okay, here it is, Have a Nice Day. Okay, very, very popular. I know it was a while ago and this is dated, but that's kind of the point. I want to show you this example of memes spreading and this algorithm being executed before the internet. So we have the idea, the fun idea. So what happens then is it infects your mind. In other words, what it does, you're attracted to it. You think about it, and it comes into your mind and say, hey, that's cool. And then what happens, which is the most important part, is it changes your behavior. So what can happen is, oh, well, now what I do is maybe I buy a sticker. Right, here it is. There's a sticker. You can buy a sticker for $2 here. Okay? Or you draw it out, or you put it on a poster on your wall, or you buy clothing and then you wear it around. So it's a weird idea, but what I want you to think about is really what's happened is now I'm working for that me, right? Just like, in a sense, just like the COVID changed me, and just like those other replicators did, because my behavior's been influenced and changed by it. And in fact, it's been changed. So, for example, if I'm buying it, in a sense, I'm not benefiting me necessarily, but certainly the creators of that media, those T-shirts, those buttons, those posters, they're all benefiting from it. Okay? And in this case, the environment is different. The environment isn't a forest floor. It's society. It's cities, towns. It's pretty much everywhere. All right. So this is an example of simple memes. And the behavior change, if we think about it for these, is pretty much buying a product and spreading the product. Okay, that's the behavior changes that happen. But what's happening nowadays with the advancement of advanced AI and the internet and social media is memes are growing so much stronger in a way, and so much more influential. So let's revisit that election day viral video that I described earlier. What happens is people that morning checked their Facebook feed, okay, and they went through and they spotted this video and they watched it because it sounded important. It's intriguing to them, okay, and relevant to their day. So they watch it and they become, what I would claim, infected by it. So in other words, they believe it and they act upon that information. Okay, so they've got that. So it moves into their minds, it infects their minds. And then what's interesting, it changes the behavior. And it changed the behavior in two ways. It encourages the person to spread that. So maybe they'll repost it, they'll put it on a different feed, on the Twitter feed or the Instagram, or whatever. Some other social media would be utilized to spread it. So the human, the host, starts saying, oh, I want to spread this, it's important. So already we have the spreading behavior of replicators. But here's the most sinister part of it. Okay, the behavior is not just spreading, like it is in really all the other replicators I've talked about. The replicators in the past, the simple ones, the fun smiley faces, people embrace them, they become infected with them if you would like, and the motivation is simply to spread it. Maybe they'll spend a bit of money, but it's all spreading. But here now, attached to this meme, to this viral, to this mind virus, we could call it, is the don't vote outcome. So the behavior is not just changed to spreading, but they actually don't end up voting now. So as you can see, this meme has had much stronger effect than our fun previous memes. It's allowed the meme creators to actually affect the outcome of the election. So let's revisit that idea again about being a successful replicator. But this time, I want to think about the replicator being a disinformation meme, like the voting, like the don't vote, the voting places are closed today. So let's look at the three characteristics I introduced earlier when I talked about the biological replicators. And what we've seen is the memes, which are replicators through our minds, mind viruses, they run the same spreading algorithm, okay? So we can use the same, so a successful meme will follow the same rules. So here we are. So again, we're looking at it from the point of view of the meme. So again, it's a little bit of a brain stretch, but I want you to do that. So what a meme's going to do is I can exploit the vulnerabilities in the host so they become infected. That's certainly one component. So what I'm going to do is let me address the first one, and then we'll revisit number 2 and 3 a little bit once I've got into one of the most important steps, which is to exploit the vulnerabilities in the host. Okay. So if we look at how that video, one of the key components of how that video for the voting got into the humans' minds and infected them. How did it get in there? Okay, remember, it was from a trusted source, or at least the person who watched the video thought it was a trusted source, when in fact it was a deep fake, okay, which is a very high quality impersonation of someone, okay? And what we'll see is that this engineered deepfakes are incredibly, well, they're getting there. They're somewhat powerful now, but I want to give you just a flavor for the future and see how powerful these deepfakes are going to be and how influential they are. So what do deepfakes do? Well, what we could call is they increase the infection rate because people are going to be easily persuaded by it. Okay, so they're going to change. They're going to like, oh yeah, they'll embrace it and change. So because it's easy to trick people into believing the media. And then the question is, where do these deepfakes come from? They use advanced artificial intelligence techniques. So I'll briefly talk about those. And again, just let me refer back to our little diagram going on inside the host, inside the human, and the behavior change. So in general, deepfakes don't necessarily stop you voting. In fact, they have the potential really to change behavior in so many different ways. Okay? And here's, though, the behavior, the theme of that behavior is the meme will make you change behavior based on what the creator of that meme wants out of you. They're going to try and take you over and change your behavior in many, many different ways. But the driving force behind this is the creator of the meme. Okay? So it's not like a biological replicator. In the case of the biological replicators, the replicators are just surviving. They're just existing. Right? They're just getting on with it. They're just living. And they came about through evolution over millions of years. Now we're talking about a completely different kind of replicator, one that's designed specifically based on the agenda of the creators of these memes. And they use artificial intelligence and deepfakes. So let's look at some deepfakes. All right, so people may have seen some of these. So what I want to do is we'll just play a little few deepfakes. And these deepfakes are for, at least the first few, are just, this one is just going to be for fun. Okay? So it'll be for fun, you'll watch it. Maybe when you watch it, you'll enjoy it, you'll feel happy, so you'll spread it to your friends. Okay? So that's just like the smiley face. Right? Just like some of the early memes were like that. They were just fun. Okay? So let's just watch this for a little bit.
Somebody once told me the world is gonna roll me. I ain't the sharpest tool in the shed. She was looking kind of dumb with her finger and her thumb in the shape of an L on her forehead. Well, the years start coming and they don't stop coming. Fed to the rules and I hit the ground running.
That was fun. Who knew Tom Hanks had such a good singing voice? Well, now we know he does, right? Because it's real? Let's see. So, obviously, anything that can be used for fun and good can be used for evil. So what I'm looking at here, what we see is I've picked the current and the former president to have equal time. But this, again, is a famous deepfake where people have been able to basically make President Obama say anything they want. So again, it's the meme creators now that are dictating the agenda. So they pick the words, they pick the script, they pick the actions. And then they make President Obama do what they want. Okay? And then that, of course, may be a trusted source for many people, and those people will act upon that. So, see the same thing here. This time with President Trump. Words can be put in his mouth to make him say anything anyone wants. Okay, so it's not just words, though. That's where we're starting to advance, right? Changing the words, changing the face, letting them talk, that's one kind of deepfake. But deepfakes are getting much, much better at this. And in fact, now they can make the people move as well. So move, go through an activity. For example, they could do anything. They could just be walking innocently, or they could be hitting someone, or taking drugs, or whatever. Could be doing something else. Okay, so we saw some examples of deepfakes, and in those deepfakes, what they did was synthetically generate data, videos, that were the person's face changed. In fact, what they did was substitute, say, President Obama's face for another person in another video. So this is what deepfakes are, and so let me just briefly talk about how they're made. I do artificial intelligence research as part of my job as a computer science professor, so I want to just give you a feel for how they work and how advanced artificial intelligence has made this possible just in the last few years. So here's a very simple example where we have an input image and a reconstructed image, and these in this case are almost the same. And so these images could be pulled out of the internet. So it's quite easy to write a program called a scraper that will just pull off all the images in the internet. And you could say, give me all the images of Tom Hanks. Okay, so a computer could automatically collect those. So it could generate a database in order to train the neural network easily. Okay, so what we see here are actually two neural networks. So this is a neural network, and this is a neural network. And I know that I don't want to get too detailed with neural networks, but just at a high level, what a neural network is it's a computational version of neurons in our brain. Our neurons in our brain are wired up. They're all very simple units. They do simple kinds of computation, but many of them are all connected together into a complex network, which actually can do tremendous things. So it's the same idea with these neural networks in computers. These, you could call them artificial neural networks. So they basically consist of many, many small, simple computing units that are all wired up together. But the power is in the fact that we can train them. We can change the behavior through training examples. So what this neural network does, in this case, is that what the two neural networks do is they basically learn how to convert one picture here into the same picture for this person. Okay, so let's look at this. And then, when we want to apply them, so we've trained them now. So maybe we pick Baldwin. Okay, so we had lots of data on Baldwin. So what we do is we train two neural networks, one called an encoder and one called a decoder. So the encoder and the decoder work in a line. So during training, the system works out how to basically generate a picture of Baldwin from another picture of Baldwin. Okay, seems like what? Okay, we'll see. There's a trick to it. And then in another case, what happens is we'll train a decoder, but this time we'll use the same, we train a decoder, but we use the same encoder for neural network for President Trump. Okay, so now what we have is we have these two neural networks, one trained on Baldwin and another trained on President Trump. Okay, then what happens is when we want to generate a fake image, we use the Trump decoder and the encoder, and we transfer one image to the other one. And now what happens is the face of Baldwin gets placed into the face of President Trump. Okay, and this is just a closer picture of what a neural network looks like. So each one of these are these layers of compute units. Okay, so this is a kind of a deepfake that can generate those videos where people say things they didn't mean to. Okay, but that's about it, to be honest. These aren't that powerful yet. In fact, there's apps you can download from the internet and make your own. It's not that complicated anymore, but this couldn't be done probably 4 years ago, 3. It started appearing in academic conferences just a few years ago. But what's the menace of deepfakes? Well, soon we'll be able to make deepfakes that can make people do anything. Remember the video to the Talking Heads song where all of a sudden someone could dance incredibly well. So what happened there is the motion, the movements of the person were synthesized, not just their face. So with deep fakes, we could make people into terrorists. We could make them into drug users shooting up heroin. We could find that someone we thought was great was actually supporting Nazism and white power and going to these demonstrations. Okay, we could do the same for someone else that we trust, say, and we see a video of them in a riot, burning property and damaging property. Okay, or we see them fighting, or we see them naked. So all those things are possible, and becoming more and more possible. Or could be doesn't have to be that complicated. It could simply be a traffic accident, say, that we can generate. So we could accuse someone of causing some damage to our car, and we could produce the video that witnessed it. I was there. I watched it. I saw that person crash into my car. So it could be anything like that. In fact, deepfakes have been used for many, many uses now, other than just political things. They've been used to trick people into sending thousands, millions of dollars to someone. Okay? Or you can even use deepfakes to basically place synthetic tumors into the images produced by 3D medical scanners so that you could convince someone they had a cancer. Life-changing events. Okay, so obviously this is so dangerous that there is a real effort now with high tech to produce ways of detecting deepfakes. So this is run by DARPA, and it's a new program. It actually just started, I think, 6 months ago, and all the big tech companies are involved. Okay, it's called the Deepfake Detection Challenge, and the idea is to work software out that detects deepfakes. Well, let's just think about how deepfakes are made. Right? Deepfakes are made by using massive amounts of data gathered from the internet, using advanced neural network learning techniques, and then using automated techniques where the neural network can learn from that data. And we run it all on very powerful computers. So that's how deepfakes are made. So what's the approach to beating deepfakes, to detecting them? Well, big surprise, it's actually what we're going to do is use massive amounts of data from the internet. We're going to use advanced AI techniques. We're going to use automatic training of neural networks. And through that, we'll be able to build systems that can detect deepfakes. Right? So we're going to use the same technique as the way deepfakes are, but to stop them. Okay, sounds reasonable. Now, this is kind of a complicated picture, so I won't take too long on this, but there's a major problem with this idea of using advanced AI to try and detect deepfakes. And it's a fundamental problem, because what will happen is that as the deepfake detectors get better, then the deepfake generators get better as well. And this is what's called an arms race. And of course, we're all familiar with the nuclear arms race between United States and the Soviet Union, where both competed with each other to build weapons that could defeat the other. Okay, so every single upgrade of a weapons system in one country generated a corresponding increase in a better weapon in the other country, and they just keep going. Okay, so the same sort of thing is happening in deepfakes, but it's much worse for deepfakes. There's two reasons. First, we're in software now, so it's very quick. It doesn't take 2 years to build something. It takes maybe a few days of CPU time to do it. So it's running at a much faster pace. But there's even more of a problem, and that is the way that they actually generate deep fakes. So this is a little more complicated diagram, but let me just quickly, so this is a neural network, this is a neural network, and these are neural networks. And this is called a generative adversarial networks. Okay, generative adversarial networks. So it sounds kind of scary, and it's true. So they're generative in that they can create media, And then the adversarial, so they actually use an arms race to build the good quality deepfakes. What they do is they have a network that can discriminate, or at least to start with, it's learning to discriminate between true images and synthesized images. Well, the synthesized images are created by a generated neural network. But here's the part that's tricky, is that what happens is learning is used, so the discriminator gets better. So imagine the discriminator gets better from learning, says, oh yeah, that's synthesized, that's ground truth. But then what happens is the better discriminator comes back and improves the generator through automatic learning. So the goal of the generator is to trick the discriminator, so the discriminator gets better at discriminating, of telling the difference between the real and the fake. But then any improvement in the discriminator is through computational means incorporated into the generator. So the system, it just is using this arms race within the creator of the deep fake. So my feeling is it's going to be pretty much impossible to ever build a system that can detect deep fakes. And in fact, in some sense, it's counterproductive, because the better we get at discriminating and detecting deep fakes, the better the generators of deep fakes will get. Okay, so let me quickly turn to a different side then of the internet and social media. I talked about deepfakes in terms of exploiting the vulnerabilities in the hosts, so they become infected. Well, there's two more steps, really, of being a successful invader of people's minds and changing their behaviors. So once the host is infected, I change the host behaviors so they work for me, infecting others. And then I exist in an environment where I can contact many potential vulnerable hosts. Okay, so let's think about this part. So this is in the internet, social media, and the idea of engineering memes, right? So how does this work? Okay, so everyone thinks they know what social media is. Okay, yeah, social media is fun, it helps me, I enjoy it. It provides a service to me. I hear from my friends, I get entertained, I find my news feeds, I become informed. Right, I find out about meetings and clubs, it's great. It's a service provided to me. Well, that's actually a side effect of social media. The real customers of social media are the people who pay for them. And the users of social media, us, we don't pay, right? In fact, okay, so the customers are who? Right? So the customers in social media are the people who are the content creators. So a simple example would be the advertisers. Okay, so you want to sell your product to people. So you pay Facebook to do it. I don't know if you remember a famous scene at the Senate where Orrin Hatch asked Zuckerberg when he was there giving testimony. Orrin Hatch was surprised. He said to him, well, how do you make any money if you don't charge your customers? And Zuckerberg actually kind of was shocked for a little while. And then he smiled and said, well, Senator, we use ads. Right? We get ads. We present advertisements to those people. And that's really how Facebook began. That's what made all the money, because the customers are the corporations or the companies that are selling products. Okay, they're the ones paying Facebook, not us. Okay, so what's going on now in social media? Okay, so we're the hosts here. And what they do is, what these social media companies do is they collect massive amounts of data about each host, each human on the planet that uses social media from all the different ways. So thousands of pieces of information are collected about each of us. And half the time we don't know what that is, we don't know where it is, we don't know who's using it. Okay? Then what happens is the social media companies apply advanced deep learning neural networks to build models of us, right? Of the people, of the humans, of the hosts. Okay, so next what happens is a customer turns up and says, hey, I want to influence those people. I want to change the behavior in some way. And that behavior may be rather sinister, right? It's much more than now than just buying the product. That's how it started. But now it's like, oh, I don't want this group of people to turn up and vote today. all right? Or I want to get these people all riled up so they will vote because they're very agitated about something and motivated to do it. Okay, so there are two good examples. And this is being paid for by the people who benefit from those behavior changes. So what happens now is the social network people identify the best potential hosts. Right? So they want to work out which are the vulnerable people, where will the message be accepted, how likely are they to change the behavior. Okay? Then what they do is they identify infectious and impactful media. Okay? So they'll actually synthesize the media. And then, of course, they can use the deepfake technology I just talked about to generate that media. All right? And then they can push it out to all the different hosts. Okay? What happens next? Well, then, of course, they can gather the data about what you did with it and get better at it. Right? Get better at influencing you. Okay. So let's start wrapping things up then. So what I've talked about is initially was the biological replicators. Okay? And we're all familiar with them, especially now in this pandemic. All right? But I gave you just some other examples too, two of the other biological replicators. And I think what was interesting about them was the way they don't just change the body like COVID does, right? COVID infects your lungs, causes you to cough and sneeze, and then those replicated particles of COVID are expelled and then have a chance of infecting others. So that's, in a sense, they change your bodily functions, right? But those other ones, particularly the one with the cats and the rats, they change the rat's mind. Okay, so the rat changes its behavior. Now it's like cats are my friends. Okay? And the rat isn't benefiting at all from that, remember. It's just the replicators that's benefiting. So that's biological replicators. And the point about biological replicators is they have no agenda, right? They're just complex biological machines that have evolved over millions of years. But now things have changed. Now we have the internet, we have social media, we have very powerful computers, we have advanced artificial intelligence. And within this new environment now, memes are the new replicators. Okay? They're thriving in this world that's been made just recently. And the most important part about them, they do have an agenda. Right? These memes can have an agenda. They can be engineered to change people's behavior. And those people, maybe, their behavior is changing. Maybe they're tricked into this, but they don't necessarily know they're being tricked. Okay? So perhaps we can change people's behavior. But what happens is that cumulative changes of behavior actually can change society. Because, just like we saw in the voting example, we only had to change perhaps 1,000 people's minds and 1,000 people's behavior to swing the vote, and now everything's different. Okay, and that agenda, though, is controlled really by any organization who wants to change it. That could be a country, a company, a business, a political party, some vested interests. Okay, could be anything, and and then what happens is social media implements those new replicators and implements that within society. Okay, so it sounds a little scary, and you should be aware of this and be thinking about this, because it has tremendous power to influence the future. And the problem is the future now is not necessarily our own. Right? It's not being controlled by us. So how will this end? Actually, I don't know. We'll just have to see in a way. I don't believe that unless we scrap the internet and go back to growing our own vegetables and just living the simple life of a few hundred years ago, and if we don't do that, if we keep the internet, then it's inevitable that these deepfakes will improve, and it's inevitable that it's going to be harder and harder to get rid of them, and more data is being gathered. So this cycle is ongoing. So I think the key we've got to think about is these questions. So can humans overcome their vulnerabilities? We know what our vulnerabilities are. We're vulnerable to this information that is coming and it's changing us. So what could be the potential solution? If these are mind viruses, perhaps we need a new kind of immune system. Right? So we can borrow from biological replicators and think about, is there an immune system that could be utilized somehow? What about a new kind of vaccine? Could we vaccinate people in a way to not be vulnerable to this? So how will this end? Okay, so I've given you some ideas about that. So I think it's worthwhile to think about our convictions, right? Where do our convictions come from? And our convictions drive our character, drive our behavior. So where do they come from? So how do we decide to believe them? Okay, it's very important. And my feeling is that one of the most important steps we could make is I don't want us to be offended by memes. Recall that when memes came out with Richard Dawkins, many religious communities were offended by it because it undermined their convictions. Okay? So all our different convictions, all our different beliefs, the idea that they could be just memes that have invaded our minds and taken over is very offensive. And in a sense, I can get that. I understand that. But perhaps we need to just step back a minute and not be offended by them. But there's some implications of that. Really what that means is this cherished free will that people have. Maybe our free will isn't absolute. Right? Maybe we're part of the equation. Maybe we can make a lot of our decisions, but maybe some of our decisions we make are actually set by other external processes, including memes. So, what's going to be our future? Well, let's just look back at a dystopian world that was described in George Orwell's book, 1984, which was actually written in 1949. Okay? And he described a dystopian world that was controlled by overlords, where the overlords controlled the population's behavior very, very tightly. There was very little freedom in that world. And how did it do that? What mechanisms, what techniques did it use to do that, to control those people? To be honest, it used many surveillance, for example, so everyone was watched all the time, so that the system, Big Brother, he called it in the book, knew what the people were doing. But there was a character in the book, the story goes that Winston Smith, he rebelled against this. He used his free will to say, no, I'm not going to buy into this. I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. So what happened was Big Brother used torture and months of it to finally break his will, so that he switched. He said, okay, I give up. I'm going to become what you want me to become. And that was the story. In fact, it didn't have a happy ending. Okay, but the key idea was his will was broken. So my feeling is, with this new world, we have to be so careful, because our free will could be taken from us without any need for force or torture. It could be taken from us through the process of these memes that are taking over our mind, planting ideas, and then changing our behavior. And the remarkable thing about that is it's so subtle. In fact, we wouldn't even know it was happening to us, and yet it could happen. Thank you.
And while we're waiting for questions to come in by chat, Nick, we talk a lot, so let's talk for just a couple of moments now. You had mentioned, such a cool part of this for me is the parallels between cultural entities and biological entities, and how the rules of the game seem just unbelievably similar. You had mentioned, I think, more speculation, but it's interesting speculation. So a new kind of immune system, perhaps a vaccine that would vaccinate us against memes. So could you give an example of what you're thinking about when you say a new kind of immune system that can protect us against memes?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I suppose I can give some examples one in particular comes to mind is these programs for anti-radicalization. So again, we don't know how successful they are, but say in the UK they've tried this, where they try and in a sense almost reprogram people who have been, you could say, infected by a meme, such as wanting to become a suicide bomber, for example. So what are you going to do with someone like that? So I would say that is a very strong meme that's changing the person's behavior, and it's very impactful. So how do we persuade them to change their minds? And I'm not sure how successful they are, to be honest. I mean, are we going to have to, how much force can we use to change people's minds? I think things have to start young in a way, but I don't like being someone who says how things should be. But of course, the usual answer is, well, we just need to educate people. And I'm not sure how convincing or effective that is, to be honest, because we live in a free society, and who gets to control all the ideas in it? It's not a very satisfactory answer for you, because I'm actually really not quite sure. I think maybe having people be more skeptical, right? Be more questioning, that would work. But there's a lot of forces against that, because a lot of organizations don't want people to be questioning. They want them to believe them and accept what they're saying. So it's tough.
Okay, thanks, Nick. We're getting a few questions in, which I really appreciate. And what I'm going to do, because we have a chance to talk every week at least, I'm going to go over some of our questions. First question is, I'll just read it as written. I agree that advances in deep fakes will make memes more and more untrustable. I wonder if there could arise trusted meme suppliers, meaning a community where memes are supplied that are credible. So do you have any thoughts on that?
That's interesting. We get back to the arms race now. So that's actually a very interesting idea. Yeah, so what we're saying is, I think people who have good intentions, maybe they need to jump into the fight as well. And we need to create memes that are fighting the bad memes, and we could get into an arms race. Let me give you an example. So for example, in the environmental community, a lot of people say, well, we've just got to educate people and let's persuade them to be good. But meanwhile, the other side, who want to dig all the coal out of the ground and burn it all, or just continue this system that's hurting the planet, they're using memes. They're aggressively targeting people, persuading them to change their mind and dismiss concerns about the climate. So rather than being passive, I believe that it really does have to get into that, the people with good intentions, and also people who are basing their knowledge on information, not disinformation, on scientific information. We need to be aggressive with that, and really, I think, start utilizing the same approaches. But we've got to be careful as well. So I don't know if I want to start using deep fakes to convince people that the climate is changing. I think we shouldn't need that, but it could happen that way.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. Another, not a question, but a mention of a Netflix film on the subject, just for the audience. So it's a documentary called The Social Dilemma, which sounds really fascinating. And I'm standing next to someone right now who says that it indeed really is a great documentary. So it's worth a look.
Social Dilemma. I highly recommend you watch that. It's excellent. And I saw it a while ago, and I really appreciated it, and it helped me with my talk too.
Question related to one I asked you, Nick, gets back to some biology, and particularly in this time, vaccines. So what would a vaccine against a deep fake look like?
Okay. Yeah, we'll start with the easy questions. I suppose, again, what's the biological analog here? So the way a vaccine works, it pre-strengthens you, right? It triggers a reaction in you that builds a defensive system. So when the real thing turns up, you already can handle it. You already know how to take it out. So in fact, that's actually interesting because this kind of technique is used in these anti-radicalization programs. They found that they actually want to expose people to radical content, but then tweak the message, I suppose, or tweak the reaction or the action to it. So perhaps you could think about that as an immune system, a way, is to actually point out what's possible and get people to react to things, but then make it clear to them that feeling that they had, that reaction that they had, was actually tricked into them. And perhaps that can help strengthen them and give them that pause before they believe it and before they act on it.
Okay, thank you. Another one is getting at what innocent is. So it's stated, could innocent sharing of memes on social media be harmful? So is the innocent really innocent?
Interesting. Oh yeah, exactly. So what is innocent, right? What's a good intention? Who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here? Yes, difficult stuff. So I think the idea is, I suppose, it wastes your time. And maybe that's the only side effect, and you might spend a bit of money. But I think one thing, though, on that note about innocence to think about with memes, memes aren't all like viruses. Actually, memes can be symbiotic as well. So we can have symbiotic memes. We can have a belief in us that may not be even true, but yet it makes us better people. And so maybe being an innocent meme, I'd say, could be one that actually makes things better, makes people better, or just doesn't really have a negative impact. And for sure, it's not based on what we would call disinformation. It could just be like a sticker, we see, or whatever it was. That game, the Pokemon game. When all of a sudden I saw hundreds of people outside with their cell phones playing Pokemon Go or something. And it was like, wow, that was definitely a meme, and it affected a lot of people's behavior. But what happened? They had a bit of fun, and they wasted some time, perhaps. Maybe not even wasted time, they just had fun. So that's good, that's innocent.
Okay, a question I've got, Nick, and this is one that is kind of hard to know a meme when you see it. So in the current election cycle, are there any particular memes that jump out at you, that you're aware of? You think, that's incredibly clever and dangerous?
Well, in fact, some of the best memes are the simplest ones. If you think about it now with these deep fakes, and it undermines, it has such power, even if now what it's done is it gives everyone an excuse. So if there's a piece of information that it may be true, right? So it's real information, it's real true, it's the actual way the world works, it's the actual reality of it. But by labeling it as false information, like fake news, for example, what a powerful meme that is, because it can just kill off hard-won information and eliminate its consideration from so many people's minds that they'll just dismiss it now. So that's an example of a very powerful meme that we're seeing tremendously now.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? I'm looking for some more on chat. And what we'll do then is I just want to thank Nick for a great opening talk. We are working out various technical aspects, as you might imagine. But we appreciate the audience for tuning in. And once again, the talk, including the introduction you didn't see tonight, will be online on our Science Unwrapped website. So we'll wrap up for tonight. And once again, thank you, Nick, for a great talk. I want to thank the people here at Media Production at USU for all their assistance. And thank you in the audience for tuning in. So good night.